hard to believe, but it's been a little over 5 years since I started this YouTube channel. And the very first mod that I chose to tackle was Boxy Pixel's one-screen DS with an all-aluminum faceplate, resulting in what is known as the Game Boy Macro. Fast forward 5 years, and a lot has changed. There are now several new mods that enhance the macro experience, even providing a fully functioning DS with one screen. So to bring it full circle, we come back to Boxy Pixel with their brand new DMG-style DS macro shell. So let's dive in and see how much the Game Boy Macro has evolved over the past 5 years with this all-new shell. Hey everyone, how's it going? My name is Tito and welcome to another episode of Retro Renew. Today we're going to be taking a look at Boxy Pixel's latest offering, which is a complete revamp of one of their existing products and is truly a piece of art. This is the DMG-style Game Boy Macro shell for the Nintendo DS Lite. Now, as a bit of background, the Game Boy Macro is a mod that removes the top half of a Nintendo DS and converts it basically to a dedicated Game Boy Advance console, since we no longer have the top screen, leaving us with just the bottom one. For this mod, Boxy Pixel originally designed a faceplate that helps make the conversion look really elegant, and I was a huge fan of it. Now, most people would do this mod as a way to salvage a DS with a damaged top screen and give the console a sort of second lease on life as a dedicated Game Boy Advance console. And while this was a great use case, there were a few shortcomings, with one of the bigger ones being the fact that the Game Boy Advance carts would stick out from the bottom, which is definitely a pretty unsightly eyesore. And another was the fact that it only allowed for 2 action buttons, vice all 4. So along comes this all-new shell, which addresses both of those concerns and adds some new features, making it quite the improvement to the original DS Macro faceplate. It now features both a front and rear metal housing instead of being a simple faceplate like the original, and the GBA carts now sit flush to the bottom of the shell, which I'm sure a ton of folks will be happy about, me included. Now, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, as we'll be taking a deep dive into all the features a bit later on in the video. So with that said, let's go ahead and take a look at what comes with the kit itself, as well as all the other parts that I'll be using for this build. So obviously the centerpiece is the shell itself. It's a full metal machined aluminum shell, meaning we get both a front and rear housing, and not just the faceplate like its predecessor. I have to say that it looks absolutely gorgeous, and as usual, Nick does a really outstanding job designing these custom shells, and this one is really no exception. Now, along with the shell, you will need to pick up these custom machined aluminum buttons because they are made specifically for the shell, and unfortunately that means we are not able to reuse the plastic original buttons from the donor DS Lite. And of course we have the full metal LNR triggers, which are listed as being optional. However, using the original DS Lite ones will require some trimming in order to get them to fit, so I do recommend getting these, as the overall mod process will be a lot easier if you do. The kit of course also comes with all the screws you need, which means we will not be reusing any of the original screws from our donor DS Lite. And here we have some more miscellaneous metal parts, such as the volume and power switch sliders, as well as some other oddities that are needed, like some die-cut felt, a plastic cartridge cover, and some optional goodies that I'll also be installing, such as a USB-C port. Now, because the Game Boy Macro mod removes the top screen, we need to essentially trick the DS into thinking it still has a top screen, otherwise it won't turn on. To do this, you can either go the traditional route, which is soldering a tiny 330 ohm resistor here on the motherboard, which is what I demonstrated in my first ever YouTube video. Or you can use some of the more modern options we have available, like the G-Bar kit, which simply installs into the top LCD connector and requires no soldering at all. The only downside being that the audio won't be all that great and pretty low, but also it uses the top LCD connector, which we would need for the screen swapping mod that would maintain the full DS functionality of the console. So instead, for this particular build, I opted to use Helder's kit, which has 2 primary advantages. First, it amplifies the audio so you get loud, crisp sound, but it also does not occupy the top LCD connector, which means we can still install the screen swapping mod. Now, unfortunately, I was not able to get the screen swapping mod for this video, which comes from Luke Wakeford. He has a very compelling kit which utilizes the space where the stylus goes and turns it into a three-way switch that allows you to swap the top and bottom screen, as well as enable picture-in-picture mode, which allows you to see both screens on the bottom display at the same time. This screen swapping mod actually leverages the work of Lost Nintendo History, who discovered this hidden DS feature through a firmware unlock. I made a dedicated video covering it in detail if you want to check it out. Anyway, that's everything that I'll be using for this build, which I'm really excited to do. But before I show you how to put it all together, let's talk about the sponsor of today's video, PCBWay. If you have an idea for a new mod or want to assemble an open source project, PCBWay provides you with the tools to make them a reality. From 3D printing services in an array of materials, all the way to other services like CNC machining, injection molding, and of course PCB and flex ribbon fabrication. So when it comes to taking your retro mods to the next level, PCBWay is the place to make that happen. Check out the link in the description for PCBWay to get $5 off your first order, and again a huge thank you to PCBWay for sponsoring this video. Anyway, now let's go ahead and build the ultimate one-screen DS. Alright, so to start things off, obviously we need to harvest the motherboard from a DS Lite, and as you can see I have a few here in front of me. All of these have some sort of issue, and I always recommend doing a macro mod to an already damaged console. I tend to buy these in large lots for cheap, and I'm actually going to be going with this one here on the right, since the top screen is completely damaged, but the bottom screen is in pretty good overall shape and it hasn't yellowed, and it doesn't have a ton of scratches, so I'm going to go ahead and start tearing this one down. Okay, so now that we have the motherboard out, we need to remove the plastic border around the screen. Now this is on here pretty good with some fairly strong adhesive, so you definitely want to be careful as you don't want to accidentally also remove the digitizer, which is also adhered to the LCD panel. And if you wanted to be extra cautious, you could disconnect the LCD from the motherboard, but I'm being a bit lazy here, so I'll be removing it while it's still connected. This would now be a great opportunity to give the screen a good wipe down with some isopropyl alcohol. Okay, so at this point we have several options on doing the macro mod. We can go ahead and install the G-BART, which is a solderless kit that simply installs into the top LCD connector. But I'm actually going to opt to install Hilder's kit because it does have an internal amp to boost the audio, and it doesn't take up the LCD connector, which we would need if we wanted to install this screen swapping mod. So in order to install Hilder's kit, we need to remove the LCD by disconnecting the ribbon cable for the screen, but you can leave the one for the digitizer still connected. Now, laying the flex PCB over the motherboard, we can actually see all the vias that we need to solder to. There are 7 in total. So once we've identified all the vias, we can go ahead and pre-tin them. Then we can go ahead and solder in the flex PCB. And then we can now reconnect the LCD. And these pads here on the Hilder Flex PCB are for the speaker. I'm going to go ahead and solder in the wires with some ample length of about 10 inches or so, since we need to route the speaker in the rear shell, and that's quite a distance away. Next, we need to remove the stylus holder and transfer it over to our new rear shell. But before we can install it, we need to apply the included felt, as this will help grip the stylus and prevent it from falling out. The other smaller strip of felt goes here and is meant to help the volume slider slide more smoothly. Now do take note that the stylus holder is a bit finicky to get in place, but it does fit. You just gotta take your time and be a little patient. And for this particular build, I'll be using the switch style speaker, which goes here underneath the stylus holder. I'm actually going to be removing these wires since they are pretty short and we already soldered the wires we needed to the Helder macro kit. Now let's go ahead and prep the front shell. The kit comes with these plastic parts that need to be separated out. For now, we just need the D-pad and action button bracket. The reason why Nick made these plastic brackets is to help dampen the sound made by the metal shell and metal buttons contacting. The metal on metal sound when pressing buttons was a complaint that some people had, which is why they favored using plastic buttons with Boxy Pixel shells, but these new brackets should help reduce the noise. With both brackets installed, we can go ahead and drop in all the buttons. Now here, I'll be installing the optional USB-C charging port. Now here, Nick recommends installing a small piece of felt here on the USB-C port to help keep it in place when the motherboard is installed over it. And this here is the LED light diffuser, so be sure you don't forget to install it. Now we can go ahead and drop in the button membranes, followed by the motherboard. And here, I'm doing just a bit of wire management to keep things nice and tidy. Now we can go ahead and connect our USB-C wires to the DS charging port. First, I'm going to tin the pins with some solder. Here, I'm going to solder the hot positive wire to the right pin and the black ground wire to the left pin. You definitely want to make sure that you do not switch the polarity here. Now we can go ahead and connect the wires from Helder's Flex PCB to the switch speaker, which is mounted to the rear shell. And here you can see how everything is all wired up. Now we can go ahead and drop in all the remaining miscellaneous parts. This part here is where the volume slider will rest, but it also secures the speaker if you decided to mount one in the front shell, which I didn't do. And with some double-sided tape, I went ahead and adhered this plastic cartridge port cover to the front shell housing. Lastly, we can go ahead and install the L and R triggers. Again, this is a bit of a fiddly task, but just take your time. Now, all that's left to do is to button up the console. And there you have it, folks, the all-new DMG-styled Game Boy Macro. I have to say that this is definitely a gorgeous-looking console, and Boxy Pixel, I think, really elevated the Game Boy Macro mod with all of the quality of life improvements, as well as the aesthetics. His thoughtful design not only makes this a great mod to do now, but it also has some future-proofing aspects, which we'll be getting into here in a moment. So with that, let's take a look at the features that this new shell brings to the table. Now, probably the biggest feature is the fact that now when you insert a GBA game, it no longer sticks out like a sore thumb. The extended bottom not only makes the console look better, but feel better in the hands thanks to all the added real estate to grab onto. Now, by extension, no pun intended, the headphone jack is now recessed quite a bit as shown here, but most headphones should still fit. But some with a 90-degree angle may have a bit of difficulty, but again, overall, it works perfectly fine. The volume slider is also now dual-purposed, as it also acts as a speaker opening, as you can see by these vents. That is if you decide to mount the speaker in the front. However, I love that Nick gave us the option to also mount a switch speaker to the back, which is what I did, and with Helder's fantastic macro amp mod, the volume is plenty loud and sounds fantastic. Another feature is the overall styling of the shell, which, as I've already stated many times, simply looks gorgeous. I love all the tiny details and the cool DMG styling cues. It's also super thin, especially when compared to the original GBA, and it's just a hair thicker than a Micro. It retains all 4 action buttons of the DS, whereas the older version only kept the A and B button. This was because the original Macro shell was designed to make the DS a purely dedicated Game Boy Advance console and not really as a way to play DS games. However, that isn't the case with this new shell. You see, Nick also incorporated these openings here, which is for the TV out screen swapping mod that was discovered by Lost Nintendo History. This allows you to swap the top and bottom screen so you can see either screen here on the bottom, or do a picture-in-picture mode that allows you to see both of the screens at the same time. I actually covered this discovery in another video, which I'll have linked in the video description, but unfortunately there isn't a kit that exists right now that utilizes these openings on top, so I used the cover which comes with the kit to plug them up. Now, as I previously stated, I actually wanted to use this really cool mod created by Luke Wakeford that incorporates this screen swapping feature by using the space where the stylus goes. Unfortunately, they seem to be sold out, but he did open source the project, which is fantastic, so you can actually make your own by using a service like PCBWay. Installing that mod into this build would have truly made this into a single screen DS. Let me know in the comments if you want me to cover this in another video, as I hear a new updated version is currently in the works. So even though I didn't install the screen swapping mod into this build, I can still play DS games. Some games are more playable than others with just a single screen, such as Resident Evil Deadly Silence, but the vast majority do need both screens in order to play. Anyway, the last feature I want to discuss is the optional USB-C port for charging the console. Since many of these handhelds come with their own proprietary charger, finding the right one can be pretty annoying. Having a USB-C charging option is super convenient since I have a ton of USB-C cables all over the place. This has sort of become a Boxy Pixel standard at this point, as almost all of his shells have a USB-C charging option, which is fantastic. Okay, so there is a lot of great features that come with this new shell, but now let's discuss the pros and cons of it all. Starting with the pros, I think the biggest one is the design. The feeling of it in the hands is pretty fantastic with all of the heft of the metal shell, and the fact that the bottom has been elongated, giving you more to grip onto for an overall more comfortable feel. Also, the extension fixes one of the biggest complaints of the Macro mod, which is how Game Boy Advance carts stick out when they're inserted into the console. Now it sits flush with the bottom edge for a much cleaner look. Also, all the little DMG design cues are great and really lend to that Nintendo vibe. From the faux speaker grills here in the front with the tapered design, to the grooves in the back of the console and the D-pad. It just oozes with subtle DMG design motifs. And speaking of the design, it has a very slender shape, and it's a tad thicker than the original DS Macro faceplate from Boxy Pixel, as well as a regular Game Boy Micro. So handling the new shell, again, really feels great overall. Additionally, Nick also, in a way, future-proofed the design by leaving some margin in the shell for neat options like installing a screen swapping mod and USB-C charging. And lastly, something new to Boxy Pixel shells are these plastic brackets which we install to the D-pad and action buttons that really quiet down button presses. Typically, the metal-on-metal contact between the shell and the buttons created some chattery metallic sounds which were pretty audible, and I think some folks did complain about this, but these plastic brackets really do seem to have done the trick in dampening out the sound. So definitely there's a lot to like about this new shell, but now let's get into the cons. So to be honest, I don't have all that many cons. The biggest one I think is probably the price to entry. To get just the bare minimum of items to get a working macro, you will need to spend a little over $140. This does not include the cost of the triggers or the donor console. So definitely not cheap, but this has always been the case with Boxy Pixel shells as they're very niche and considered a premium product. If you want to do a build that's similar to mine with the metal triggers and things like the USB-C option, as well as the Helder kit with the switch speaker, it'll be closer to $160, again without the cost of a donor DS Lite. So in the end, this will be a pretty expensive mod to do, but if you want an absolutely awesome premium Game Boy Advance with DS capabilities, I think this is the way to go. Now, another issue that I'm not a huge fan of is the fact that we're forced to use the custom metal buttons due primarily to the design of the shell. This isn't that big of a deal, but it would have been nice if we could also use the original plastic buttons from the DS Lite. We were able to do this with the original DS Macro faceplate, but with this one, unfortunately we're not. And the last con that I want to mention is that the triggers themselves are a bit finicky. I found that loosening the screws on the back helps this a bit, but for such an expensive mod, I would have expected these to work flawlessly. Now it seems that these triggers do have an issue in that they were not machined correctly at the factory, which may have contributed to this problem. And we can see that they are discounted on the Boxy Pixel website because of this, so it's great that Boxy Pixel is transparent about this issue, but I would maybe hold off on getting these particular triggers and perhaps temporarily use the original plastic ones until the updated units are available for sale. But other than that, I have to say that I absolutely love the DMG styled macro shell, and Boxy Pixel has yet again nailed this reinterpretation of the mod. Well folks, there you have it. Boxy Pixel's all-new DMG-styled macro shell. It definitely shows how far this mod has come over the years, while also providing some room for future improvements. Now, if you enjoyed this video, I really think you'll like this one here, so check it out. And as always, thank you all so much for tuning in today, and I'll catch you again next time.